Okay, folks, welcome back. And here we are at the course on fundamental principles in Catholic bioethics, the process of evolution, including the human evolution. And we'll begin, as always, with a little prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of your divine love. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. First of all, any questions or comments from previous material? Today we're going to zero in and drill down into the evidence for human evolution. Up until now, we've been covering different aspects of the process of evolution, more or less in general, principles that happen and the evidence that we have for that in nature as we look at not only the fossil record, but also current living species and the big issue about percentage homology and phylogenetic tree that is much more detailed and complex today than the previous, more primitive phylogenetic trees based mostly on external morphology, right? When we go into the whole issue of molecular genetics and studying the percentage homology of DNA between different species, or the protein expression of that and the sequence, the actual sequence, that gives us a much more accurate picture of the relatedness between individual species, right? Much more accurate than just the morphology, the external morphology that we can see. And just to connect with the lecture last week, we were looking at convergent and parallel evolution, right? I gave the example of parallel evolution between marsupials and placental mammals. So you notice that marsupials from Australia and placentals from the rest of the world are all mammals, so they belong to the same class, and therefore there's relatively close relationship already, because not only do we all share, let's say, an internal skeleton that is articulated, right, makes us vertebrates, but beyond that, we're also mammals. And so fairly closely related already, but then the evolution that occurs is after a large geographical isolation, specifically between Australia and, let's say, North America, okay, for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. And then similar environments will allow for similar characteristics to emerge, even morphological characteristics, as the ones that I was pointing out between the marsupials and the placentals that look similar, but the ancestor has to go back millions of years, because that's when the continents divided, all right, separated. Okay, anyway, when we look at the phylogenetic evidence of that or connection, then we can trace a fairly close relationship between marsupials and placentals and the fact that we are mammals, all right? So that's the percentage homology there, much more accurate than just the external characteristics that we see. All right, we're going to use some of that also for the human today, as we're focusing specifically on human evolution. And just for a moment, to put it in the bigger picture of the course itself, of the phylogenetics of humanity as a whole, right? The evolution of the species as a whole, because we want to be faithful, if you will, or loyal, both to the biological evidence and the anthropological evidence that is based on the fossil record and the actual living creatures that we see today, and also our faith, which speaks of a creator and the creation of the human as some special creation, some particular creation, particularly in the image of God. So we want to be faithful to both those things, if you will, to the point that in next lecture, we're going to pick up then the biblical evidence and the biblical narrative of the story of creation. And my hope is to show you that far from being mutually exclusive, in other words, evolution or creation, they actually complement each other very well and very beautiful and give a fuller picture of not only creation in general, but the creation of the human species, of the human person, okay? So we still have this one more class to do on the biological side of things for the human specifically. So these are some lines of evidence that we can look at for human evolution. First, the phylogeny, the phylogenetic tree, and our phylogenetic classification, right? Going back to Linnaeus, to the Linnaean classification as Homo sapiens. The fossil record for common ancestors. Then drilling in based in part on the fossil record, in addition to contemporary anatomy, measurement of the skull size, because the size of the skull is a reflection of the brain size, okay? And also the physiognomy, in other words, the shape, the actual shape of the skull, the eyes or the eye orbits coming more forward for stereoscopic vision and so forth. Those are all telltales. We have to infer from those anatomical features change in behavior, essentially, to a bipedal locomotion. So we're going to look also at a particular graph that shows an association between the skull size, or inferred the brain size, and the development of culture in the human from the Paleolithic age until modern times. Bipedalism, how that comes around, may have come around organically, physiologically. And bipedalism frees up the four limbs, the forward arms, forward hands, into tools, using tools and making tools, which is a further step of sophistication. Also harnessing fire for one's benefit, for the benefit of survival overall. And more development of culture, things like art, religion, clothing, okay, burying the dead, which are getting more and more specific into human characteristics. Okay, so this is kind of a rough outline. And also the handout that I gave you is still an incomplete outline, all right? But it's based on another author that has a chapter dedicated to human evolution, and I'm diverging from Meyer here in this one lecture. I'm using Bartow instead, Bartow's book on evolution from 2007, and specifically chapter 25 there. Okay, so that's the reference, Bartow and Associates.
Is there a way, like a PDF of the chapter?
Possibly, you can Google it. I bought the book, but you can also find it used. You can pick it up for $10, $15 typically, sometimes less, because at this point it's 12 years old. But just go online and Google it and see what you can find there, okay? All right, so let's get into it. Starting with the phylogeny of the human species. Here's our classification starting at the domain level, all the way down to the actual current species. And the only current living species that we know of within the genus Homo is Homo sapiens. And some scientists drill it down to Homo sapiens sapiens, okay? Some scientists have got into putting the subspecies, which would add a second species name, if you will, to the genus. But I'm just going to keep it simple on Homo sapiens. You never know when humanity may be surprised with the discovery of another Homo that is non-sapiens somewhere in some deep forest or cave somewhere in the world, okay? But it's highly unlikely, highly unlikely. At any rate, all we can say is that that other species has not been discovered yet today, all right? So we claim that there is only one Homo species living today. But there is evidence, mostly from the fossil record, of anywhere between half a dozen to a dozen different Homo species that were not sapiens. Of course, probably the most notable one is Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalis, which actually coincided with sapiens for several thousand years in Europe and maybe some part of the Middle East. Okay, so going back to the phylogenetic tree, in the Linnaean classification, starting at the level of domain, and we can talk about shared characteristics just in general. This is kind of a review of stuff that we've covered before. Let me make this a little larger here. See? A little more space on it. Okay. And how about just getting a little fancy here. Okay, so at the level of domain, which is the largest grouping possible, right? How many domains? The three: eukarya and archaea and bacteria, all right? So that's as large as we can get, as inclusive as we can get, without including the eukarya and the bacteria. We share what? A true nucleus with every other species that is a eukaryote. Okay. So that relates us at the level of domain with every other living species, every other animal, every other plant, and every other fungus, essentially, at the level that we all have true nucleus. So it's pretty broad, right? From there, and that's the only characteristic really that we can say that we would share with those other phyla, okay? We'll drill down to the level of kingdom, which is the next general category underneath domain, okay? We would fall under the animal kingdom. So again, there we share those animal characteristics, including at the cellular level, that we do not have a cell wall, for example, that would distinguish us from the plants, and that we are mobile, and that would distinguish us from the fungi. Okay. We can drill down further because there are many, many different types of animals around, all right? So we can go down to the level of phylum, chordates. Now that is going to distinguish us with a whole large group of animals that are not chordates, that do not have an internal skeleton, basically. So you can think what we call in general lower animals. You can think of insects, we can think of starfish, you can think of worms, jellyfish, sponges, right? Many, many, many other animals that don't have an internal skeleton. But we do, so we're at the level of chordates. And then the subphylum, which is more known than the chordates actually, the subphylum of chordate is vertebrates. So that internal skeleton is articulated, particularly at the level of the spinal cord. So you notice the advantage of an articulated internal skeleton. It offers the best of both worlds, if you will, for mobility. It offers a rigidity that comes from the inside, as opposed to rigidity of the outside. What is one obvious distinction? So what other animals have a rigidity on the outside, which is actually a skeleton, but it's known as an exoskeleton? Your arthropods in general, right? The arthropods And what is the obvious difference? So chordates, and like I'm saying, the subphylum is more familiar to us in general than chordate. The subphylum of the phylum chordate is vertebrates, the vertebrates. So what are the vertebrates? Mammals, fish, birds, amphibians, reptiles, okay? The 5 classes of vertebrates: fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, all right? Internal skeleton. You notice that a big difference, just obvious difference between the vertebrates and the ones who have an exoskeleton, which are the arthropods. It's just the sheer size, the actual size. By an internal skeleton, we can get much bigger. And so we are physically the largest animals on, not we humans, but vertebrates. The vertebrates are the largest animals on Earth by far because of that internal skeleton. So that's a great advantage. It gives structure, it gives rigidity to a certain degree, okay? So it allows that body mass, the body size, to become much larger to any of the other animals. And that's why we call the other animals that don't have an internal skeleton lower animals in general, because we tend to look down on them. They're smaller in general, okay? But they tend to be more simple also. Typically, they don't have a closed circulatory system with arteries and veins and so forth. I'm talking about insects. I'm talking about starfish, sea urchins. I'm talking about sponges, jellyfish, worms, all kinds of worms, whether round worms or flatworms. Okay, you get the picture. Anyway,
all those animals are invertebrates, but they're still chordates.
No, they're not chordates. They are unchordates. They don't have an internal skeleton at all.
So what's a chordate that's not a vertebrate?
Yes, good question. Those are very primitive-like structures. One is called a lancelet, which looks a little bit like a fish. They have a notochord. They have an internal, somewhat rigid cord, but it's not segmented, Okay, let me show you for a moment. Probably the picture will say 1,000 words. And it's actually put at the level of a phylum. There is a lancelet. Okay, this is what they look like. So what you see segmented here is actually little muscles, but what we will call this, the cord itself, all right, the notochord, this little structure here, this one, it's hard to tell, this one here, that one is not segmented, all right? And you can see it goes from head to tail, and it's, so therefore, this notochord is an internal skeleton, but it's not segmented. So it's more rigid. It's somewhat flexible, yes, but it's not segmented in the way of vertebrae. Whereas the vertebrates, we all have vertebrae. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And those are the 5 classes of vertebrates. But actually, because of the phylogenetics, those vertebrates are a subphylum of the chordates. The chordate is the bigger picture. It's just that the other chordates that are not vertebrates, it's a very small group. And typically, there are these lancelets. Just about that I know of, the only representative of the chordates that are not vertebrates that are still living today. Others are fossils.
Why not just create a class? Why not just create a phylum?
A phylum of vertebrates. Yeah. It gets a little technical, and frankly, I confess that I don't know the exact details because I'm not a taxonomist. But these categories, kingdom, class, order, phylum, class, order, they have certain parameters, they have certain canons, they have certain regulations, all right, of why. I mean, to me, it would make sense to put the vertebrates into their own phylum, but apparently these 5 classes of vertebrates don't meet all of the requirements for an actual phylum. So we're stuck in there underneath the chordates, under the umbrella of chordates. Luis, can you?
I think that it has to do with the notochord itself.
Mhm.
We and that ontology recapitulates phylogeny,
Yes.
to a certain extent.
Yeah.
We have the notochord.
At the embryonic, early on at the embryonic stage.
And I guess that we are in the same line of the amphioxus in evolution, and that's why we're
group.
the same group, I guess.
Yes, yes, and that's true. You bring up a good point, which is the embryonic stage. We tend to minimize the embryonic stage, say in daily life, because you know, they're hidden and so forth. And we kind of put a lot of emphasis on what is most obvious to us, which is either the juvenile or the adult stage. But for phylogenetics, the embryonic stage actually may count more, right? Because it's showing earlier developments. Early, and like Luis said, that notochord is there in the early embryology of vertebrates. The notochord is there, and then it gets segmented. Okay, but first is the whole concept, if you will, and reality of an internal skeleton as a whole. Now, when I talk about internal skeleton, what do we think of? We think of an actual skeleton, you know? But no, an internal skeleton can be reduced down to this one cord inside this one rod. Rod is the word I was looking for. This one rod, let me see if I can make this bigger, because it's even in this diagram, it's not too evident what I'm talking about. Let's try this. Hopefully, yeah, I lost resolution. Yeah. Come on over. How do I bring this thing over? Oh, here it is. Okay, it's large enough. So you see this segmentation over here. All right, those are muscles. What is shown to be, it's a diagram, but it's shown to be segmented is muscles. And on this side also. But in between those 2 muscle layers, there's this little rod, okay, that is not segmented. And you notice that it goes all the way from head to tail. All right, that's what is being called notochord, but noto is just a reference for nautical, for swimming, but the cord is the substantive. It's kind of one of those German words that has the adjective attached to the noun. But the noun is the substantive, it's the important thing, the cord or rod, we would say a rod. That rod qualifies for being an internal skeleton, and it is unique for the chordates. That's what makes us chordates, that cord, all right? Which we would call normally a rod. Here's the actual photograph of the creature, and you can see the segmentation, those are muscles, all right? Not to be confused with the actual cord, which can barely be seen here, a little bit more down here in this pale pink color, all right? That cord then qualifies for an internal skeleton in a very primitive way. It's not even articulated or anything like that, but that makes this little creature a chordate, all right? And this is the only living species of what we think was a larger group, but the rest are extinct now. A further development from this is that that cord becomes segmented in the adult stage of the vertebrates, all right? And then those vertebrates are subdivided into 5 classes, which is a lower level from phylum. Phylum, class, order, family. The 5 classes, again, are fish, amphibian, reptile, birds, and mammals. If you think of any one of those, I had a slide last time, we all have the spinal cord articulated with vertebrae. Aside from the appendages, all right, the spinal cord itself. So that's the origin of an internal skeleton. And the great advantage of that internal skeleton is that it gives more rigidity to the body internally, and therefore the body can become physically larger. Physically larger is an advantage in survival, because now these creatures can get larger than whatever is chasing them, whatever is selecting on them. So that's a very awkward and probably not too clear explanation of the importance of a cord, so much so that it deserves the category of a phylum. But then that segmented cord is a subcharacteristic. It's not sufficient enough to become a phylum in itself. Anyway, drilling down further, the subcategories of the phylum are always classes, right? In the general, remember, each one of these categories can have sub and supra also. It gets too detailed. But at the level of class, we are mammals, in contrast to the other 4 classes. So I'm just drilling into the phylogeny of the human species, right? Which means that as mammals, we share common characteristics with all the other mammals. I think there are about 28 or 30 orders of mammals. I don't know, but you can think of, I mean, we're as mammals as whales at that level, all right? And we are as mammals as bats. We don't look that similar to each other. Basically, all we have in common with the bat and the whale is hair, and whales do have some hair, a few, and mammary glands. Sorry? Yeah, the Batman, exactly, the hairy Batman. Okay, so we can drill down at the level of order. At the level of order, we're primates. So that already distinguishes us at the level of order. We're no longer distinguishes us from the whales and the bats because they're not primates. The whales are cetaceans. I don't know what the bats are. I don't know the order of bats. But you see, at the level of order, it's starting to get more and more narrow, and we start looking more and more similar. Further into orders is the family level. And at the family level, we're already hominid. But I point out the ending of hominid or hominidae in Latin, DAE, all right, hominidae. And there we share with other hominids, other great apes. As for example, the 3 other great apes, the chimp, the gorilla, and the orangutan. Then comes a subcategory of the family that is the tribe. Okay, and this is a taxonomic category, but we don't see it that often. Typically, below family, we're used to seeing the genus, several genera under one family. But this one, there is a particular category that has been created, and in part because of the fossil evidence, and also in part because we're so intrigued about our origins as a species as a whole. And so we have this level of tribe, which is, this is more, there is a confluence here between a tribe at the anthropological level and at the cultural level, right? But it's not the same tribe that we will talk about, for instance, when there has been some reference to African tribes, for example, okay? That word tribe used in contemporary terms of different African tribes, or we can talk about, typically, I think there's less use of that word today, perhaps because of cultural and social sensitivity, right? Probably today we talk more about ethnicities, but in the past, I'm old enough to remember it was used in common language, tribes, African tribes, or South American tribes. It typically was a reference to primitive lifestyles. Today, probably we talk more about ethnicities and tribes. So I just want to point out that that connotation of tribe is not the same as this one. This is a more technical anthropological term that is used and has its own validity. Okay, it's not necessarily a reference to primitiveness, is what I'm trying to say. And here is where we get into the hominin, all right, the hominin tribe, which is different from the hominid family. It's one layer in, deeper, more specific. Then finally, we can go into the genus level, which is just one up from the species, right? The genus level, and the established genus for us is the Homo genus, all right, or the genus Homo. But it turns out that there are other Homo species belonging to the same genus, of which we have a fossil record, okay? And so we have to deal with that, with a human in the sense that we understand humanity today or not. That's the big question. Those would be our closest ancestors. All extinct today, but there's a fossil evidence. So we're going to get into that fossil evidence. Before we do that, just to put this phylogeny in kind of a visual perspective, here we are at the level of eukarya, sharing with other animals, plants, and fungi, and even these protozoans, right? This would look like maybe a paramecium or an amoeba or euglena. Remember those? They have a true nucleus, but they're microscopic and typically single cell. So at the level of eukaryotes, at the level of domain, we share the same common characteristic. Then it starts getting narrowed down. When we go to the phylum level, to the kingdom level, we already have to exclude the plants, the fungi, and the protozoans, right? When we go into the chordate level, and this is a big jump here, we exclude what we call normally the lower animals. No, I didn't put any worm here because the worms would be the most abundant of these lower animals, different kinds of worms. Okay, so going to the class level, mammals, we would have to exclude the other vertebrates, right? The other non-mammal vertebrates, fish, reptiles, birds, amphibians. So I'm going to pick up here from the level of primate, which is at the level of order, and show you a few other examples. How are we primates, and what characteristics we share at that level of order, okay? So let's go there. See, this is the level of primates. These are other primates that are non-human. What is known as the old world monkeys. The old world monkeys are mostly in Africa and in Asia. New world monkeys are over here in America. I think there used to be monkeys in North America. I don't think there are any anymore. All right. But, yeah, there you go. And the reasons that were introduced by the filming of Tarzan. Okay, but in Central and South America, it's still around. Also, further back, phylogenetically, there's a little phylogenetic tree here, right, with the nodes, the points of branching. Are other creatures called tarsiers. They're mostly nocturnal, and that's why they have those big eyelids, big eyes. In fact, I think they don't have eyelids. So more primitive, but still primates, okay? Further back at a branching that occurred way back here, some other creatures called bush babies that look very similar to the tarsiers, but they are actually on a different line. So this could be an example of maybe parallel evolution. A branching off with the bush babies are lorises and potos. And notice these are all existent, okay? These are all extant or existent. And finally, the lemurs out here also, which branch out earlier. It implies some kind of common ancestor, which is extinct today. And I'm sure there's a fossil record there somewhere, but I didn't bother to look into that. But this phylogenetic tree would be constructed mostly based on the DNA percentage homology. Why? Well, because all of these species are extant, are living today, and therefore we can extract a little bit of blood and do a DNA analysis and do some sequencing and see the percentage homology, or on the protein, which is the expression of the DNA, right? That's how these things are constructed today. All right, so this is at the level of order. Let's drill further in at the level of family now. Okay. We are hominids, hominids with a D, and it includes what is known as the great apes, and these are the 4 groups of great apes: the orangutan, the gorillas, the chimps, and us. What I've put in parentheses is precisely the percentage homology, either at the DNA or the protein level. It's just 2 different techniques to arrive at the same result. So you can see with the orangutan, 97%. That's a lot of homology, right? With gorillas, 98, and with the chimp, 99. Average. The skull, we can say that outside of the group of hominids, all of these skulls are quite similar outside of the group of hominids. But inside the group, they're quite distinct. Inside within the 4 hominids, compare, look at this, the kind of standard average orangutan skull to the human skull. 2 or 3, at least 3 main things should be obvious, starting from the front, moving toward the back, if you will, just systematically. The pronounced jaw of the orangutan versus the receded jaw of the human, with the resulting flattened face for the human. Also, in a little bit of detail, the pronounced canine there, which is very receded canine for the human. And moving toward the back, probably much more significantly, the reduced brain size compared to the enlarged brain size for the human, all right? Whereas the other 2 fellows, we would expect them to be somewhere in between those characteristics, and in fact, that's the case. The jaw in the gorilla is still pronounced, but not as pronounced. But the canine is pretty much there, and even in the chimp. But the brain size does get larger as we approach the human. Okay. However, the important thing here, and these are myths that we're trying to dispel and blow out of the universe. The fact that the human species has evolved and that we share common characteristics with the other great apes, all right, with the primates and with the hominids, does not mean absolutely that we descended from the monkey, just as it doesn't mean that the monkey descended from us. Why? Because we got monkeys today, right? And we got humans today. And so we are contemporaries. And by definition, we cannot have ancestral contemporaries. Either they're ancestors or they're contemporaries, okay? And so because all of these 4 species or 4 genera are living today, we cannot be ancestors to each other. We cannot have derived from each other. What we could have, and we do have, is a common ancestor, all right? That is primitive from our standards, that is extinct, and may have been the node that gave rise to the branching. But here we have 4 distinct and definite branching, because all of these species are alive today. Okay, so that dispels that myth that was floating around ever since Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, including the human evolution. And he, sarcastically, he was presented a little bit like ape-like, that he was a monkey, because he was saying, or he was attributed to saying that we were deriving from the monkey, which is as untrue as saying that the monkey derived from us. Okay? All right, let me move forward. We're going to drill now into the line that diverged between the chimp and us, since we have the 99% homology. And we are the 2 closest species today. We are the 2 closest species today, all right? That divergence is estimated to have occurred between 8 and 5 million years ago. Some people narrow it down further, between 7 and 6 billion years ago. All right. So that still puts 2 million years of margin. Now you consider 2 million years of margin of error within 6 million. So that's a 2/3, that's a 30% margin of error. Okay. Anyway, going back to the idea, let me repeat it again. The divergence, the node between today's chimp and today's human, is thought to have happened anywhere between 8 and 5 million years ago, or between 7 and 6 million years ago. That one is a broad range, the other one is a narrow range. But even if we take the narrow range of 7 to 6 million years ago, that's still 2 million years. 2 million years out of 6 or 7 is about 30%, 25, 30% of margin of error, okay? So what I'm trying to say by this is that that divergence date is fuzzy. What is not fuzzy is the actual divergence, that the divergence happened. Again, because we have chimps and we have humans today. So there had to be a divergence. When exactly we place it? Well, it goes back to the paucity of the fossil record. What do we mean by paucity? Paucity, the lack of abundance of fossil record. The fact that we have some fossil record is already pointing at some common ancestry. So let's go further in there. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Looking at that diagram though.
Yep.
It seems to me that obviously whoever did it is a scientist, but shouldn't because gorillas are actually in the hominid.
Yes, current gorillas, yes.
So it just seems to me that the gorilla should be moved 1, 2, 3 to the 4th bar.
You mean, okay, so there's millions of years, you're talking about millions of
I'm not
years?
talking so much about the years, I'm just
Okay.
but the idea is that they're in the same line, but they're not the same.
Yes, okay, so just because of the constraints, the visual constraints, this is necessarily a flat diagram, it's 2-dimensional. But in reality, this would be 3-dimensional because this gorillini here at some point would have to branch out into the 3 current, all right? It's just that we don't see it, and you can see, obviously, it's much less detailed down here than it is up here, because the point is that this diagram is trying to show the hominin development and not the gorillini development, all right? So if we were, for example, if we were studying gorillas or chimps, this part of the diagram would be much more detailed and further branching occurring here, right? But the whole point here as the break is put, let's say between 7 and 6 million years ago on the narrow side, or some people want to keep it broader simply because there's not enough fossil record evidence to pinpoint it that much. 5 to 8 million years. The whole point about this diagram, not read too much into it, is the divergence between the hominini and the gorillini, all right? Because I'm going to drill into the hominin. I'm going to drill into the hominin line, because this line further needs to branch out into two main groups, the Homo and the Australopithecines, which are southern apes.
That decantation means that the Homo sapiens comes from the Homo habilis in that order?
Homo habilis, yes, yes, okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're looking at this. We're going to drill into this further, all right? We're not there yet. And for the purpose of diagram here, this should have been further branching, of course. These two large rivers, okay, or confluences, in reality are much more branched. It's just that for the sake of clarity and simplicity, they didn't want to show too much detail here. Just the main issue here is the divergence between the hominins with an N, which at the level of the tribe hominin is what I should be saying, and tribe gorillas, tribe gorillini, which includes the chimp. In fact, there's another branching here that is not shown at all, which is the branch of the orangutans.
Yeah. Be tribe orangutan?
Possibly, yes, but I'm not familiar with the technical terminology. And again, I didn't want to, maybe I should include it for future lectures just for the sake of completion. But the orangutans branched off before the gorillas branched off. And that accounts for the 3% difference instead of the 2% difference. Okay, so I'm going to drill further into the hominin tribe, because at some point that hominin tribe has to diverge at least into two main genera. One genus is going to be Homo, and the other genus is going to be the Australopithecus or Australopithecine. Let me show you a diagram of that. And this is directly from Barton, as you can see here. Okay, so that's the reference. It's an actual photo of the page. Again, going back to that origin of the hominin, or the branching off from the gorillas or the gorillini, 6 to 7 million years ago, I'm taking the narrow range, 6 to 7 million years ago, or 7 to 6 million years ago. Here we are with a common ancestor, which some have classified as Sahelanthropus. Again, a compound word. Remember, part of the added value of these courses, you get a little Greek and Latin along the way. Okay, start with the noun part of the word. The anthropos or anthropus is a reference to human-like, anthropos, here, okay, or anthrop. Remember, we talked about anthropomorphism is putting human qualities on animals, like Mickey Mouse, right? Anthropomorphism. So anthropos is a reference to the human or human-like. And then the adjective that is stuck, German style, okay? Sahel is simply a reference to the Sahel region, which is around the Sahara. It's the boundary between the Sahara and the rest of Africa. So basically, the claim is the location. They've added the location into the genus name. Okay, so these are, if we translate this into more or less common English, is southern apes or African apes. Sahelanthropus would be that common ancestor, which then went through a few iterations, the Ardipithecus and the Australopithecus, right? Eventually, Australopithecus branched further, but Australo are going to pick up now onto Australopithecus or the Australopithecines. Australo, again, Pithecine is a reference to ape-like. Australo is a reference to southern. Australo is a reference to southern, just like Australia. Australia is the southern continent, right? And sometimes you see the word Austral in reference to South America. Austral, the Argentinians, I think, still use it, the Chileans. So Australo, the adjective Australo, the prefix, is a reference to southern. Pithecine or Pithecus is a reference to ape-like. But this branching is, this node is important because here we get the branching of the Homo, of the species Homo.
Is the meaning of the Afarensis like sea fighter?
I'm not sure. Afarensis, yeah, these were mostly the Leakey family who were discovering these fossils in Africa around the Lake Victoria region. Leakey family. Oh yeah, okay, Lucy, the famous Lucy, bipedal. Afarensis from afar. Interesting, from afar. Yeah, some of these Latin names can be a little esoteric. You wonder why. Some have put geography into the name, location. Some have put a particular biological or physiological characteristic into it. Some have put their either first name or last name into it, the actual discoverer, okay? And this is a reference from a distance, which is kind of symbolic or meaningful. Afarensis is a reference from afar, the southern ape from afar, okay? The far relative. At any rate, the node here implies some kind of common Homo, still yet to be found, because these are actual fossils. Whenever you see an actual name, that's a fossil, okay? So we have the actual physical evidence, the factual evidence. Habilis, over here, branching with Rudolfensis, which is a reference to, I think it's the actual guy who discovered it in Germany. So this is the first Homo branching that we know of, at least from the fossil record. But you notice it's about 2 million years ago. So our Homo line, if you will, starts anywhere between 2 to 2.5 million years ago, estimated, inferred. Habilis, of course, is extinct. From Rudolfensis, it is thought that there was a development into what is known as ergaster, which is a reference of becoming erect. Ergaster is becoming erect, all right, or bipedalism. From there, a true erectus, in other words, that was able to maintain the erect posture all the time. Further branching, Heidelbergensis. Now this is a reference to obviously the place of Heidelberg, which is a city in Germany to this day. So these are European fossils. Neanderthal, branching from Heidelberg, and Sapiens eventually also branching from Heidelberg. So according to this diagram anyway, a common ancestor between us and the Neanderthal was Heidelbergensis. It's sketchy, but at least the big picture, if you back out, the big picture is the big branching between the line of Homo, the genus Homo, and the Australopithecines or the southern apes. And one big difference between these two is mostly the bipedal. Even though Lucy was bipedal, yes, Lucy was bipedal. Yes?
So between Australopithecus africanus and Homo rudolfensis, I can't see for sure.
Yes, here.
What is that name there?
Yes, this one?
Yes.
Okay, this is a hypothetical. It just says HSP, so Homo species and a question mark.
So is that like what they call a missing link?
This is, yes, it depends. The missing link with whom? The missing link with the other apes? Yes, with the southern apes, yes. This would be the missing link at the Homo, at the level of genus.
Well, how do they know that Afarensis didn't come directly from, maybe there is no missing link?
From habilis, yes. Okay. Again, it's a very technical question, but the idea here is, first of all, for some of these, we have a single fossil, and typically a head is the best fossil to have because you can glean more information from the head, all right, or a skull. But sometimes there are several skulls classified within the same species, all right? So that is an enrichment to have several representatives, again, because of variation. How do we know that the skull that we have is the mean, is the average skull? It could have been, you know, off the mean. It could have been a super large head for that particular kid, or which doesn't represent the average. So be careful not to assume that the skull that the fossil that we have is the average. Doesn't have to be. So that's a big caveat. That speaks to variation, right? However, the people in the know, the anthropologists who do study this and are specialists, have determined that there is enough difference between the Rudolfensis skull and the habilis skull to put them in two different species. Okay? Which implies that if evolution is true, then there should have been a common ancestor between those two. Because if we have two different species, then that implies a node somewhere, a branching off. Okay, let's move further into the genus Homo, all right, which the fossil record, depending on how it's read, and some of it is still controversial and debated and disputed among the experts, but anywhere between half a dozen to a dozen different species in the Homo, in the genus Homo. Which really is, I think it's quite a lot actually. We have only one surviving species. But what the experts are telling us is that within the genus Homo, there may be up to a dozen evidence for a dozen different species. Minimally half a dozen to a dozen. Okay, let's try to put some flesh on these skulls. These are the actual skulls here. The photograph, of course, the photograph of the skulls, and then the reconstruction that has gone on. Today, computers are used for this reconstruction and so forth, but with what they have that has been found, and they project the rest of the skull. And once they project the rest of the skull and make a model out of it, right, then they project out the rest of the body. So from the skull, and sometimes they also find associated bones together with the skull. Hopefully they'll find a rib, a tibia, a femur, something, okay? So they try to reconstruct the rest of the skeleton. Once they have the model skeleton, then they move outward from what is known of anatomy and physiology today. A good anatomist, given a human skull, a good anatomist, just from the skeleton, could reconstruct all the way out to the skin, right? Going by layers, attaching the muscles that will go, the skeletal muscles that will go to that skeleton, and then putting adipose tissue and the layers, the dermis and the epidermis, all the way up to the skin level, okay? So that's what they do with these guys, so that eventually they can actually put, these obviously are models, right? They can put a face to that skull, to that fossil. And this is how they would look. Generally, if we back out and try to stay with the big picture, we can see a general transition toward a more human-like face, gradually, going from about 7 million years ago, 4 million to 2 million years ago. One big characteristic is this whole issue of the ridge above the eyelids, which diminishes gradually as we go toward the sapiens skull. Okay, let's move further in. By the way, this is on the southern apes, okay? So this is on the branching off side, just for the sake of completion, if you will. But it stops here, and these are still southern apes. Now we're going to look at the other branch of the hominins into the Homo. Here's at the level of Homo with the skulls that have been found, together with their reconstruction into the model. Here is the original branching between habilis and rudolfensis about 2 million years ago, and then had the ergaster branching again into Homo erectus and antecessor, Heidelbergensis here, and the final branching between Neanderthals and us. So it gives a time frame, more or less, in the past 2 million years. Now, let's try to put some flesh on these, and these are, again, photos that I found on the internet. Here we have the 6 species with their skull, including skull reconstruction, and then modeling out to the layer of the actual face, starting from about 2 million years ago through to about 40,000 years ago, where at this point sapiens is considered to have coincided. There's plenty of anthropological evidence that we coincided with Neanderthal, and that there was interbreeding. In fact, you've heard of that, what is it, 23andMe or something like that, that does the heritage, the DNA. What is it? There's an online service. Ancestry.com, something. Yeah, okay. You can, some people do that, and we all get a certain percentage, what? Neanderthal. We get a percentage Neanderthal, okay? There's actual tissue from Neanderthal, so the Neanderthal has been sequenced. There's a genome, the Neanderthal genome. Now, how representative that is, but again, keep in mind that back then there were fewer individuals overall, so it would be to have 1 out of 1,000, or 1, let's say, out of 100,000 is much more representative than to have 1 out of 7 billion, right? And even the human genome originally with Venter and those guys, when there was the Human Genome Project from the 90s to 2000, what did they use? They used 100 humans. So 100 humans back then represented the 7 billion, right? So variability, the range of variability was pretty narrow. Speaking of variability, I wanted to point that out. No, before a little more drilling here, the skull size. I want to concentrate on the skull because the skull is actually indicating the brain size. Okay, now it doesn't necessarily talk about the convolutions in the brain, but at least the overall brain mass. Yes, bigger actually than us on average. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But look at this, starting with the, so here's the line, we can draw a line here, okay, for the southern apes, the Australopithecines would be here. For example, Lucy, all right, which was already erect, bipedal. We draw a line here. Here is the southern ape, almost less than 500 cubic centimeters, 500 cubic centimeters of brain. Today's chimp, this Pantrogladitis, this is today's chimp, is 400, so more or less within the range. Then the first, some of the most primitive Homo, the Homo genus, would be habilis, about 550 cubic centimeters. Here's habilis. Not much difference between 450, 550. It's within the range, okay, of 500, let's say 500 cubic centimeters. Look at the big jump between habilis and erectus. 1,000 cubic centimeters, double the brain size. Again, it doesn't say anything about the convolution, but if we could draw more or less a parallel or a correlation between brain size and convolution also, much higher brain activity, right? From habilis to erectus, and yet they're only, they're less than 1 million years apart, from 2.5 to 1.8 million years. So this was a big jump here. Big jump in evolution, doubling the skull size, doubling supposedly the brain size, but it doesn't stop there. Because then by the time we get to Neanderthal, it increases again by 50% to 1,500 cubic centimeters. So from erectus to Neanderthal, 1,500 cubic centimeters. And that could have taken longer, almost from 2 million years ago to 500,000 years ago. So it took longer, this span of increasing the size by another 50%, not even double, by another 50%, took at least 3 or 4 times longer. So we see overall there was kind of a peaking here by way of brain size increase around the 2 million year mark, from before 2 million years, or before 2 million years to after 2 million years ago. On the Homo genus, the brain size doubled. Since then, it'll only increase by 50% more. So that's another way of looking at it. For comparison, here's Sapiens with 1,350 or 1,355, is rounded off to 1,350 cubic centimeters, 1,350 cubic centimeters, as opposed to Neanderthal, 1,500. So we actually have a smaller brain, literally, okay? Implying perhaps less brain capacity, not necessarily. In other words, it is estimated also, associated with this, that we, or Sapiens, wiped out Neanderthal in Europe and the Middle East. Okay? Sapiens wiped out Neanderthal, even though Neanderthal had a larger brain and a more corpulent, larger overall body size. So we could infer from that that at some point, if we get too large, it's not optimal. It's not optimal. So smaller brain size, but also somewhat smaller body, perhaps made Sapiens more agile than Neanderthal, to the point that it wiped out Neanderthal. Okay, now, so a lot of speculation here, but what is really known factually is that these two species, definitely two different species, interacted, but then they're also interbred. And at some point, they had some kind of fertile offspring, but, or I don't know, let me take that back. I don't know if they had fertile offspring or not, but what is known is that the Neanderthals did not survive, became extinct, whereas the Sapiens continued.
I was just thinking,
We absorbed them.
yeah, I was just thinking when they had that big, giving birth
Yeah.
would lead to
Could
a
be.
lot of mortality probably.
Could be.
Maybe other mother.
Yeah, it could be.
I'm serious.
You are so right.
Well, yeah,
I mean, it's hard enough with them.
it could be. We know that from the Sapiens, right? That before the C-section, the average lifespan for women was around 40s or 50s. Most women died on the last childbirth. for those who created. So yeah, it's a point.
This is arguably the most controversial theory
Yeah.
of extinction
Mm-hmm.
that I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there are competing theories
Yes.
that makes the philosophical and the biological genetic level.
Yeah.
At the genetic level, you have examples with some rare breeds of dogs, like dingo,
Right.
in Australia,
Mm-hmm.
that they are being wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
They're purity
Uh-huh.
by the stray dogs that are interbreeding with them.
Uh-huh.
And some people are saying that probably they will disappear as a pure
Yeah.
subspecies
Right.
very soon
Mm-hmm.
because of that interbreeding. I'm thinking that maybe that's one of the things that happened.
Mm-hmm.
If at some point there were some kind of environmental bottleneck and the population went down significantly,
Mm-hmm.
and they interbred humans, maybe they got absorbed as a small percentage in the population. But then you have other authors, maybe from the church,
Mm-hmm.
theologians, saying that, well, those were the people that Cain went to live with at the time of the
right. How to make that distinction? Yes.
And what happened after they were wiped out during the flood and all.
Right.
They are saying that those
They
are
try to
humans.
They try to dovetail the biblical evidence in a more literal sense with the fossil record. Yeah. Yeah. In the flood, right?
Have you heard that?
The
Some.
Neanderthals were, I mean, this would be Neanderthals were lost in the flood?
Some try to speculate that, right? Because there's very scant evidence about the actual flood at the physical level. But I approach it from a different perspective, and actually that would be our last lecture, which the basic question would be this, to concretize it. We don't question, at least from a phrase perspective, we don't question that Homo sapiens has a soul. Did Neanderthal have a soul? To me, that's the key question. Did Neanderthal have a soul? And if they did, then they would be in heaven with the sapiens also. So the other species, but even the species taxonomy is controversial. For example, you mentioned the dingo, but is the dingo a separate species from Canis lupus, or is it a subspecies?
I think it's a kind of a subspecies or a breed. It interbreeds perfectly. It's similar like
with familiaris, right?
Yeah.
In other words, if it does interbreed, then the biological definition of species, Meyer's definition of species, has its limitations. Okay, and we can always that's what we say, that the exception confirms the norm, right? We're always talking about norms here, and I've seen actual classifications. That's why I mentioned Homo sapiens sapiens, because some people give so much humanity to the Neanderthal is that they would put Homo sapiens neanderthalis, and they would make us Homo sapiens sapiens. So they're putting the Neanderthal as a subspecies of the Homo, as opposed to, in contrast, with the species on its own. And if we lose the biological definition of species, because there is some DNA evidence of Neanderthal in us, then we have to assume that there was some level of interbreeding. Otherwise, how did we get that DNA? How did we get DNA incorporated into our species? We cannot make the case of viruses, for example, that actually integrated into our DNA, because Neanderthal wouldn't have the capacity to do that without interbreeding. It's getting technical. What I'm trying to point out is that even the classification is controversial. It's not all scientists are solid on this, okay? But what is true is that we can see a gradual development, at least from the skull, significantly from the skull, from the Australopithecines and the branching from the Homo and the non-Homo with the brain size, and then a doubling and a tripling of the brain size since the origin of Homo. So since the origin of Homo habilis with 500 cubic centimeters is basically has the same capacity, brain size capacity as the southern apes. But since then, there has been a tripling of the size, more or less tripling of the size of the brain. But also, I want to point out another little caveat here, picking up on 2 lectures ago of variation, that I'm showing here from CTs, computer tomographs. So this is actual data of skulls of living contemporary humans, all right? The variation. Look at the variation. Look at the variation in size and shape of face, even though the face is pretty much flat and frontal, facing forward. But look how receded this one is, how pointed out this one is, okay? Looking head on forward to the face, look at just the delineation of the orbits of the eyes, all the variation, and these are all Homo sapiens, okay, of faces of living people today just from CT scans. So look at the variation, all right? From underneath, looking at the foramen magnum, going into the brain here, into the skull. From below, again, CTs. Look at the variation. It's amazing. Look at that. So there's variation within the species, right? Then when we go back and look at these fossils, how do we know that this is the typical fossil for the rule of, how do we know that this is the norm? Because there's paucity, there's only a few fossils that are being found, okay? Obviously, the more fossils that are found of that species, the better reconstruction we can do of the average, of the norm. But we don't know that the fossil that is found actually represents the typical or is off the norm, maybe more pronounced or less pronounced on particular characteristics. So we have to be very careful when we interpret these fossils and we start putting flesh on them. That do we have a representative fossil or do we have an individual that is off the norm? We just don't know until we find more, until they find more. Okay, let me move to another area here. Maybe this would be a good time to take a break because we still have a few slides to go. But we'll break here because now with this slide, we're going to start dovetailing with the skull size and cultural evolution. All right, cultural evolution, for example, the beginning of art and things like that, the beginning of using tools and making tools. Okay, and that's this graph here. So let me stop here for a moment. We'll take a break. Any questions, comments? Okay, we'll pick it up here. Yeah, please.
I was going to mention that from the fossil record, Homo sapiens is dated back to 100,000 years ago.
Anatomically, what we call anatomical modern man, anatomical modern human, about 200,000 years ago. In other words, anatomical modern human means that if we were to see one of these humans from 200,000 years ago, just let's say naked, male or female, and we would see a naked male or female of today, we would not be able to distinguish them. Okay? Anatomically modern human. Culturally, it's even less than 200,000. But for the Homo, that's at the level of species. At the level of genus, about 2 million years ago, with habilis, all right? At the level of Homo. But to me, the question is, when does God posit a soul in the Homo line?
I've been thinking about it because I'm more of that hypothesis that it's not that clear cut between species, but it's just
variation.
like
Yeah, there's a
pick a couple human being and place that light, that all of a sudden you see another spectrum versus the other humans around. Because obviously in the story of Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
you have people, humans living at the time of Adam and Eve.
Right.
Because it says that
We'll
Cain
get there. Yeah.
was sent to live with them.
Yeah.
And so.
And marry. Who did he marry? He didn't marry his mother, right?
Right.
Okay. So yeah, we'll pick that up actually in the next lecture, next Saturday. But I'm going to leave you as homework to look up mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. All right. We'll look at those, but that's going to be homework. Okay, let's break here for a moment because we're going to get into this one, which, like I say, is a dovetailing between the anthropological evolution and the cultural evolution of the human. So I recommend that you take a good break and recharge with ATPs with some glucose for the next session. Let me pause this for a moment. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Let's dovetail now some other lines of evidence associated with the increased skull size of various species in the genus Homo. Right? And just to put it in context, let me go back to the beginning here where I had some kind of a flow. Looked at phylogeny and the fossil record, skull size. Now we're over here, association between skull size and cultural development. All right? So let's go there for a moment. It's this graph that I keep referring to. The actual notation is a little small, but on the x-axis always there is time flow here. And notice this, the scale is not to scale, okay? It's not to scale because here is 2.5 million years, 2 million years, 1.5, 500,000 years, 100,000 years. So it's not to scale. And this one, the y-axis, is cubic centimeters of brain or skull size, which again is not to scale, not to proportional. You notice that it goes from 4 to 500, 5 to 600, getting small, so it's more of a log scale. But it is proportional in that way, in that it is an increasing time lapse going backwards on the x-axis and an increasing brain size going upward, okay? All right, now, there are actually two types of graphs here, superimposed, or two types of data. One is the more anthropological, physical, morphological of the skull, and the other one is what I'm calling the cultural evolution and the cultural and technical evolution. So let's look at that. First, clusters of the 6 different species of fossils. Here is Pananthropus, is the yellow, okay, here. And this little line, this little straight lines is a regression. So it's a slope, is kind of the regression or the average trend here with Pananthropus, which are definitely southern apes, okay. Then we start on the Homo from here up. These are all Homo. Habilis and Rudolfensis are the triangles that are open triangles. So here's a cluster, you see it here, with its line, regression line. Then Erectus and Ergaster are the open squares. It's here, it's more dispersed. This is the dispersal here, okay. And the regression line actually is this one, number 3, because these are closer. So these would be outliers on that regression line, and the actual regression line is here, because these are closer fit. Next group is what they're calling archaic sapiens, or Helmei is another alternative. Homo Helmei are the solid squares. Solid squares are here. clustered around here. So it's this regression line, 5. All right. Erectus is the solid triangles, and that's this cluster, which is actually line 4. Heidelbergensis and Neanderthal, solid circles are here. And that is, They didn't put the oh yes, sorry. 5 is actually the regression line for Neanderthal and Heidelberg, because there are more circles, solid circles out here. Okay, so 5 is Neanderthal and Heidelbergensis. Finally, 6, which is the open circle, is Sapiens here. The first thing that we notice, sticking still with this anthropological data, the biological data of the skulls and the fossils, all of these slopes are positive except the human. That's a negative, or sorry, yeah, the Sapiens, okay? Sapiens actually has a negative slope. And all the others have a positive slope. This is skull size. So what it's saying, remember, it's relating the skull size, cubic centimeters, to the age, all right? So what it's saying is, in general, with passing of time toward modern times, in general, for every other species, the skull size has increased, except for the human. In the transition between Neanderthal and Sapiens, the skull size decreased. So this is kind of putting in a graphic sense the other data from here, from this, okay? In other words, that there was an increase in skull size gradually until we get to Sapiens. And then in the Sapiens, because we have the 1350 cubic centimeters as opposed to the 1500 of Neanderthal, then there is a negative slope. Now, the other part of this graph is this gray line, which is more or less sigmoid, all right? Or at least it seems to have a bit of a lag phase and then a log phase. This is a cluster of technical and cultural innovation that they're calling, technical and cultural findings. So what is clustered here? What is plotted here? All right, for example, tools, right? Use of tools, which is already down here with the southern apes, some southern apes. There's association of using tools with the southern apes, and certainly with all the other in the Homo line. Okay? Then exchange of goods, if you will, exchange of stuff. Here it is, long distance exchange. In other words, this is some evidence of clan behavior where they would do some kind of trade. Now, more precise tools here. Barbed points, bone tools as opposed to stone. That's a level of sophistication, is to use a bone for a tool. Fishing, all right, which we attribute fishing to a fairly human characteristic. We're not going to see, well, I take it back, some animals do fish, but without tools, with no hook. All right, they fish on their own, certainly, but no hook. At some point, beads. Now think about beads, making beads, all right? Can you find any particular function to a bead other than artistic? What can you use a bead for and they're with a hole, threaded, and so forth. So we're looking at the beginning of collars. What do we call those? Collars that women wear around the necks. Necklaces, jewelry. All right. What would be the function of an animal using jewelry? The what?
For counting,
Yeah, it could be for counting, but to me, the first intuition is sexual selection, an extension of the fitness. Sexual selection. Okay. But definitely on the homo line. There's no evidence of Australopithecines having beads or any kind of art. Continuing, well, now we get into the Neolithic, the Metal Age, using metals. Okay, actually using metals, extracting metal from nature and making something out of metal, a tool. It's correlating, basically, what is it correlating with? It's correlating with a larger brain size. It's the whole point of this curve, to see the association. Maybe correlating is a very strong word because the two curves should then follow the same kind of pattern, no? But at least an association of increased brain size with increased sophistication of culture and technology, what they're calling innovation. The metals, the use of metals. Writing, we're getting way up there. Language that is put down in writing.
Are you saying, I'm just trying to double check, the evolution of writing is not corresponding to
What I'm saying is this. Let's say writing over here. Let's take this as an example.
But they're
Okay?
not correlated to the species of skull.
Yes, they are.
All right,
Between
so
800 and 900 cc's of brain, what do we have? We have the cluster of the open squares, Homo erectus and Homo
I just
ergaster.
want to double check. So what you're saying is that there might have been some writing at the time of Homo erectus.
Exactly.
Okay.
That this brain had capacity at least for developing writing at that early age. All right. Then musical notation, that is definitely artistic. And it's hard to see the immediate survival implication of musical notation. And yet, by 900 cc's, there is apparently some evidence of that. But sapiens really is not appearing until here's 1300, and here is the first square, solid square, right? 1300 cc. So before 1300 cc, everything is pretty much the culture, the basic culture is established already, or the capacity for basic culture.
How do we explain that brain size reduction?
Here,
Any theory?
well, the one theory that I've heard, if you will, is that there was an optimization. In other words, it was not runaway. One way of seeing it, perhaps, is that the Neanderthal went into a runaway type of evolution, all right, to its own detriment, because a species that had actual less brain size was able to overcome them. The problem is, it's speculative, right? Because that species, that other species, is no longer living today, so they cannot speak for themselves. And I'm sorry to say that I don't really know enough about the Neanderthals. I should get more into it to see at the level of detail what was the competition and what was the competitive advantage for the human. Was it that, in fact, being smaller was more agile? Or is there any kind of evidence that we actually had more convolutions even though we had a smaller brain? It was more compact, but the surface area is a different story because that's where reasoning takes place, no? Abstract reasoning and strategizing, for example, and so forth, all right, for defense mechanisms and not. So it could be that even though we have a more smaller cranium size, we actually have more convolutions than the Neanderthal. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Which will give us the advantage.
At what point do they believe that capacity, or I guess the capacity for speech or sound would always exist, but the actual development of the language?
Well, language, we have to be careful with language because even animals that are distantly related to us have a language, right? You think of the whale songs, for example, that even are specific to pods. And it's obvious by the singing of birds that they have a language too. Okay. It's known to them, but not to us. So what makes it more specific, but staying on the line of language, is written language, of which we have evidence only on the Homo genus of a written language. And associated with that is also art, because written language is really symbolic. Why would, a series of letters actually make sense to us in a particular language of the 4,000 or 5,000 languages that are today, okay? Because this is a symbolic representation, just like art is symbolic. Another animal looking at a painting would make no sense of it because they also have the capacity to make sense of it. So we have developed a capacity for symbolic.
So at some point, the capacity for symbolization starts to occur, and what you were saying that
globally around 1,000.
Erectus.
Yes. Yes.
That the capacity for symbolization starts, right? Symbolization actually.
Yes, around perhaps just under 1,000 cc's. But it puts it double to the Australopithecines, to the southern apes, because their average is about 500 cc. So it took a doubling of the brain essentially to develop the culture that we know to this day. And yes, and communication in symbolic language.
I'm confused.
Okay.
So capacity versus actuality, I guess. So these
Good
people are
point.
not writing, because writing's only been around since Samaria, right? So you're saying
that we know of. Yeah.
Capacity to develop writing,
right?
But there's no evidence they actually wrote anything.
Well,
right?
so
I'm not.
What's the background data to this graph? Is perhaps what we should get into, which I don't have. What's the background data?
I just don't understand how they're. Whoever made the graph, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying, somebody decided that a certain amount of brain capacity, these people or this group or whoever they were, had the ability to begin writing.
Yes.
Okay, but then why did it take until 5,000 years ago? I mean, it doesn't make sense. If they have the ability to do it, why didn't they do it, or at least begin some?
Well, there are several reasons why. One thing is perhaps we haven't found the data. Okay, we just haven't found it. This only speaks to a theoretical capacity. Another thing is that those humans actually didn't leave any data because they didn't have any time to leave the data, all right, because they were either fleeing from predators or just at a survival mode where they did not have settling down. You notice that the writing, the Sumerian, the cuneiform writing and all that does coincide fairly nicely to the beginning of agriculture, right? When humans were able to finally settle down and not have to be moving from place to place. And then there was an explosion of cultural things, including art and clothing and so forth, that was much more sophisticated than the previous millennia, because now we could actually stay put at a place season after season and having to go after the food all over the place, okay? So that settling down, what we call civilization or sedentary life, was a big, big jump in humanity, but it was a jump culturally, not anthropologically. We had the capacity, like anatomically, let's say, from about 200,000 years ago. But not culturally because of the lifestyle.
I may add that it's a lot easier from a statistical point of view to be able to find a record from a big settlement. Maybe it had thousands of people living there and leaving some records, and maybe wow, we're able to find one that just pick a record for a small tribe that was moving around nomad, and maybe whatever record they had, the internal culture, is nothing.
Got buried or disappeared, or
to leave a remain of that would be very hard.
Too small and look like that. That's what they call material culture, what people leave behind, right? The material culture that is found. It's true. That's another point that is well taken. Is just the small number of these individuals like that. Okay? Maybe hundreds, thousands, we don't know, but certainly they probably were not millions. Just the actual number of individuals. So individually, they're going to leave just quantitatively less stuff behind. And typically stuff that has been found around the actual fossils, the actual skull or piece of a bone, whatever is found in that location. But this is very much a work in progress. I would not read too much into this graph, only that the big picture, for the purpose of associating the increase in skull size, generally here, with the increase of cultural innovation and technological use. All right, that's really the big picture and all I'm concerned with in this graph. It's got too much detail. Unfortunately, I apologize, I don't have the background data to it, but that's what I wanted to point out. It's a general association with increase in skull size, assuming that the brain was also increasing proportionately, and increase in cultural sophistication, if you will, or cultural innovation. Okay, this is kind of a little summary, but I also want to shift to another line of evidence, which is this whole issue of bipedal. In other words, what could possibly trigger this increase in skull size to 3 times as large as the common ancestor of a common ape, which would have estimated around 500 cubic centimeters, right, to the 1,500 or 1,300 that we have today. At least in part, it has to do with becoming bipedal, at least in part. So again, between the half dozen to a dozen Homo species that are known to have existed from the fossil record, one main characteristic of all of these Homo species is bipedalism. In other words, walk on the hind legs only and free up the forward legs so that the hands now become free, all right? And they're not locked into having to move. Freeing up the hands is a tremendous thing. If we think of it in evolutionary terms, because now we have essentially our own tools. The first tool that we have is our hands. Okay? Yes, that's right. Okay, so this biological characteristic then, the bipedalism, having just been able to walk for extended periods of time, either walk or run, on 2 legs without having to come down on the forward legs at any point. And the second one, which goes into the behavioral also, is this increased brain size, and then other characteristics associated supposedly with the brain size or the increased brain size is making tools, and not just using, but making tools, all right? And also using fire for one's advantage. Using fire, harnessing fire has several advantages that we'll look into in a minute. So again, just the reference of the tribe itself, development of the hominin tribe, 6 to 7 million years ago. So look at what happens with the shift of from four-legged to two-legged. The center of gravity shifts squarely on top of the hind legs, with the hip as the pivoting point. So here's a skeleton of a chimp, pan, troglodytes, and a human. It's a diagram. The center of gravity for the chimp is around here. And that's why the chimp has to go on four legs, even though the chimp can walk on two legs for a while. It's called, you know how that's called? Anybody know? It's called knuckle walking. All right, knuckle walking, because the chimp can go on the two hind legs. You notice that two hind legs are dissimilar to the front legs. All right, the bone structure is very dissimilar. The foot is flattened definitely. And so the front legs are looking more like hands, like arms and hands. However, because the center of gravity is displaced from the hips, for the chimp, even though the chimp can walk on two legs for a while, after some time, he has to go down on the front legs because he gets tired. He can't take it for an extended period of time. So it's not true walking indefinitely, all right? And that's why it's called knuckle walking, because he has to come down on the on the front legs at some point. And the faster he runs, for example, being chased by a predator, the more often, and he'll do that thing, he'll run. They can run faster on two legs, but then they get tired and they have to go on four, and they have to combine back and forth between 2 and 4 and so forth. And that's what's called the knuckle walking, right? Because their center of gravity is displaced. And the center of gravity is displaced precisely because their spinal cord, which is segmented, has a single curve, all right? And it's a curve forward. Whereas for us, because we have that subtle but real S shape, the S shape of the vertebra of the spinal column, allows the top part of the body to be placed directly on top of the hips and on top of the hind legs. All right, so this is the true full bipedal position, where the upper body balances and lands squarely on top of the hips.
Do the arms have to shorten? It looks almost like they're about the same size.
They are a little shorter, especially in proportion. We can ask the question, shorter to what? Okay, not in themselves, but shorter to they're more in proportion with the hind legs, whereas in the chimp, they're not proportionate. Okay, they're more disproportionate, if you will. But again, remember, form follows function and not the other way around. In other words, the structure of the thing is according to the function and not vice versa. So we could infer that by assuming this bipedal position, gradually there was the longer legs were favored and shorter arms were also favored. Okay? In other words, for the arms to be functional as tools, as grasping hands, they didn't have to be that long. This was a burden to have them that long. Okay? Whereas the opposite makes sense for the legs. If I'm going to be walking only on two legs, then those two legs, the larger they are and the longer they are, the bigger stride. Okay? And so we can see that there is an evolutionary favoring of longer legs than the knuckle walking legs, which, as you can see clearly, they're shorter in proportion to the forward limbs. Okay, so my point here is specifically with regards to the S shape of the column, the spinal column, landing squarely, putting our upper body squarely on top of the hips, which allows us to walk in principle indefinitely. What does that do? Freeing up the hands, then a synergy occurs between the brain and the hand, because the hand, of course, with a motor response, is responding to brain activity, but at the same time, with the hand discovering that the hand can do more, is challenging also the brain to think more, if you will, and to somehow favor a larger brain or a more convoluted brain to put these hands to good use, okay? Or to take advantage of the dexterity of the hands now that they're free, including the development of culture. Because now the hands are not tied up as they are for survival, as they are for the chimp. Again, the closest relative with the knuckle walking. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that perhaps a physiological explanation for the association between increased brain size and increased cultural innovation could have been bipedalism, the freeing up of the hands to stimulate the brain into becoming more sophisticated and requiring a larger capacity.
Well, that's currently, I think, some of the thinking in artificial intelligence, that what we are learning is not just adding facts, that the artificial intelligence is actually now being able to network. So they're not, instead of just being an addition, a simple addition, now it's becoming, I don't want to use the word geometric because I'm not that sure the concept, but that it's being able to form complex
multilateral or multidimensional,
and connecting different ideas, which is how I think intelligence actually
they have works or evolved and actually works. Yes, so it's not just the actual size, like you say, adding more facts or adding more, but the connection, the connectivity, and the relationship. All right. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, let's look at how possibly bipedalism could have evolved, because now what we're going to add to this, adding layers of complexity gradually, all right, even though it is definitely speculative, is a climatological change. Because unless there is a climatological change, there's not stimulus for selecting non-variation on the favored variation. All right? And this climatological change, there is, again, evidence for it, of this gradual transition in Africa from a tropical rainforest to a tree savanna to a bush savanna. Again, staying with the big picture, what the transition that we see here is fewer trees. And the trees are further apart from each other. And concomitantly, more grassland or open range. All right? So, a climbing animal like a monkey, all right, at the level of order, where they would do well in a forest situation, meaning well adapted enough to get away from, certainly from predators, from ground predators like the felines, okay? Just by simply climbing a tree gives them an advantage over the hunters, their predators. If that tree density begins to disappear, that's a selective pressure to favor those who could periodically get on the ground and move faster from the predator until they found another tree to climb, which was further away. And there is evidence of this transition of climate, which move the tropical rainforest through the savanna stage, through the tree savanna into bush savanna. And further, the one I didn't put here because it's beyond the scope of interest, is actually eventually desert. And so that is the gradual but real desertification that has happened near just north of equatorial Africa. So these are two maps for comparison. This is an actual photograph. This is a Google photograph of today's Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, you can see here, plus Mediterranean Europe, some of the Middle East, Madagascar, all right? So this is an actual photo. And you can see that tropical rainforest has been restricted pretty much to the equator. And this is the Congo Basin, which is one of the two lungs of the earth, the other one being the Amazon Basin. But the northern part of Africa, which is the widest part, geographically speaking, is one huge big desert, what we call the Sahara. The Sahel then is this boundary here, all right? But if we go back about 14 million years ago, not that long in the history of the earth, look at this. Most of Africa was actually tropicalized, okay? And the desert area was restricted to three main foci here on the northeastern coast of Africa, southeastern coast, and then pretty much the Arabian Peninsula. Also, notice that what is superimposed in this map is not just, one thing that is very evident is a greener Africa 14 million years ago compared to today. What is not that evident unless we notice it is the little white line actually denotes current the landmass, right? The current coastline, as you can see from here. I look at the Mediterranean, Africa, Mediterranean coast is delineated with the white line. But look where the actual continent was 14 million years ago. And yet, under the surface, the Africa and Asia were connected already, all right? So basically, this is pointing out to a higher sea level back then. It's a higher sea level. What we call, again, a tropicalized Earth, where the poles were melted, okay? And so the water level was higher. It was warmer all the way around the world. And so this is consistent with a tropicalized Earth. Tropicalized Earth. But this gradual but real process of desertification is eating up the forest, and the transition stage is the savanna, which can be further subdivided into isolated trees, tree savanna, and then moving later further into the desertification process, just a bush savanna, and most of the trees are now gone. So we can see that the terrain is more conducive to bipedalism on the primate side. Since they're already in the forest side of things, for the primates, and for monkeys in general, their hands and their feet are prehensile, right? They can grasp from their hands and their feet. But then that grasping capacity is lost gradually as they transition to the ground. And the grasping capacity is retained in the forelimbs, the forward limbs. Now, some applications of that, dexterity of the hands, of the forward limbs. Applications is not only the use of tools, but the actual making of tools. Because we know, we have evidence today that a number of animals, a few animals actually use tools, right? Not only is the chimp known for using tools, even though it's very primitive, they'll take a little twig and stick it into a termite hole, wait for the termites to climb the stick, and then they proceed to take out the stick and eat the termites. Okay, so that's definitely using a tool. Actually, some birds can do something similar with a little twig. They can, with their beak, they can probe into a hole and try to get an insect out of there. That's been documented. So that's using a tool. Fine. But making a tool, we have not seen it in any other animal than the human. So that's considered, at least for now, to be a homo at the level of genus characteristic. And what's the evidence? Well, the evidence is the chips of stones, to make a sharp edge. That had to be done with another stone that is possibly harder than the stone that is being used for to make a knife or to make the sharp edge, okay? And there's evidence of this going back to about 2.5 million years ago. Whereas for harnessing fire, the evidence so far goes back to about 1 million years ago in this cave in South Africa. Now, there are several advantages to harnessing fire. For defense, obviously, because most animals who are sane, they run away from fire, okay? But we actually go toward fire to harness it and use it, and we can use it then for defense against other animals, typically the predators. Warmth, obviously, in the cold seasons or in the cold nights, but also to light up at night, so it extends our time of tool making and even just gathering around the fire and so forth and socializing. So it has a potential for increasing socialization in lighting, and cooking, which has a definite physiological advantage because biologically what cooking does, it begins the digestive process. It begins to break down the molecules, all right? Particularly protein, where we can get more out of it. It will be easier then for the digestive tract to extract those amino acids from the protein. And so cooking actually begins the digestive process, right? And it was probably just discovered from some hungry primate, and some meat fell on the fire, and then they were so hungry that they ate it. Now, some evidence, one can ask, well, where is this evidence? Because how do we know that it was cooking and not just a wildfire? Look at this. This is a cross-section of some ash and carbon that was found in this cave, all right? And some study was done on this piece, which is a burnt bone, all right? Burnt bone. And with this analysis, the experts can tell the way the bone is burned that it was a campfire type of temperature and not a wildfire type of temperature. Now, don't ask me how they're able to determine that. That gets very technical, but it goes down to the molecular level, how the molecules actually carbonize. They can determine the intensity of the fire. All right, and it's estimated that the fire that carbonized this bone was more in the range of a campfire than a wildfire. Apparently those two have a significant difference in temperature degree, all right? So they can tell that. This is the level of sophistication that goes into these studies. But the whole point is that there's evidence that fire was harnessed, at least for these 4 advantages, selective advantages.
And that would be Homo erectus at the time.
Yes, but exactly, not habilis. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know, another 1 million years, which is precisely the jump. And that's the jump. That's one of the jumps anyway, from 1,000 cc to, from 500 cc to 1,000 cc of the brain. Okay. A few other characteristics that are associated with human cultural traits. I mentioned them briefly already before, the development of art, which doesn't seem to have an immediate advantage, selective advantage of survival, okay? Rather, it's appealing to a higher order of symbolic communication. Burying the dead is pointing to what some believe in an afterlife, as primitive as that may be, because no animal actually truly buries the dead with the ritual and the meaning that we see even in the most primitive of the Homo line. Wearing clothing, and of course, the development of religion, even in the most primitive cultures that we found, that anthropologists have found on Earth, They all have some kind of religion that obviously is going to be mixed in with magic and superstition and all that, but that whole realm of the supernatural, we just don't see it in other animals, okay? So it's a very typical human characteristics, possibly pointing to a soul, a human soul, which would have to be the strict domain of God. Because no matter how hard our parents try, they could not create our soul. Okay, they could only give us their DNA. Okay, so some example of burying the dead. I'll pick this up again in the last lecture of the integrating the science and the theology, but just a little bit in anticipation. The oldest human burial found to date is actually very recent, only 100,000 years ago in Israel, in this cave. And this is what they found inside. It's believed to be a mother. Well, it's a woman because of the hip, the circular hip, right? And a child here. So it's presumed that it was mother and child. Could have been the aunt, we don't know. But a woman and a child buried in a kind of fetal position. And there's evidence around this area that they just didn't fall there, they were actually buried, all right? So there was some kind of ritual involved. Maybe they found other things around it, some material culture. And also possibly a Neanderthal burial in France as recent as 50,000 years ago in this other cave. And this is what they found in there. So it's estimated to be an actual burial, perhaps the position of the skeleton, which experts can tell was more or less a fetal position, which maybe later with time flipped around. But this one is about 50,000 years ago, and it's a Neanderthal, it's not a sapiens. Another possible evidence for Neanderthal having a soul.
So who we saying was alive 100,000 years ago is still erectus?
No.
Erectus
It's
is
yes. It's sapiens and Neanderthal that we know, at least from the fossil record. Okay. Then there's another one that has come up. I didn't have it. I should. This is a work in progress. All right. I should amplify this, including also this Denisovian that I've mentioned. Denisovian. It comes up a little further down in another slide. Let me go back to geography for a moment. What is not disputed is that all this took place in Africa. The origin of Homo took place in Africa. What is disputed is how and when they came out. And there are two basic theories, which are kind of mutually exclusive, just by definition. There was a single emigration, or that it was multiple emigration, out of Africa once, or out of Africa several or many times, for the Homo, for the genus as a whole, all right? And the time range is anywhere from 1 million years ago to 200,000 years ago. So this is still controversial. It's a work in progress because fossils are still being discovered. The pattern, the general pattern, so again, to reiterate, what is not disputed is that the origin of Homo was from Africa. What is disputed is how and when it came out. The how, either once or several times, and the when, anywhere from 1 million years ago to as recently as 200,000 years ago. The pattern of dispersal, again from Barton. So here's Africa, generally along the west coast of Africa. So moving west toward the coast, that's the general migration pattern that was thought. Moving west until they got to the shoreline, and then just started migrating the shoreline. In fact, it's a little more detailed than that. It was thought to have been equatorial Africa, somewhere around here. Here's Lake Victoria, and the other lakes are Lake Turkana, the other lakes associated with the Rift Valley, the Great Rift Valley. And again, the Leakey family, this is where they started digging and have been finding fossils, Homo fossils, all right? So in this general area, moving eastward, when they hit the coastline, they had two choices. Some go north and some go south, just like Lot said to Abraham, right? Okay, if you go north, I'll go south. And it stands to reason that some group would go south, a clan, another clan would go north. Eventually, what happens is there's enough geographical variation that with time they could develop into different species, which if hypothetically they would come back together, they could no longer interbreed.
Was the Arabian Peninsula still desert?
The sea was lower, right?
Gradual desertification of it, right? But keep in mind, here we're at the level of hundreds of thousands of years, whereas the map that I showed you back here went back to about 14 million years ago. Already there is desertification in the Arabian Peninsula more than in Africa by proportion.
But at that point, they're theorizing that the Arabian Peninsula was more
a little more tropicalized.
Amenable to life that people could have crossed as opposed to crossing a desert. Okay.
Right, at least along the coast. Now, the other advantage of the coast is, of course, that you don't have to depend so much on land itself because you can depend on fishing, right? And other creatures that they find along the way on the coast. Typically, the coastlines are rich, or they used to be rich before modern man that exploits the ocean a lot on the coastline. And we have a lot of cities and towns and villages have developed along the coastlines of the entire Earth. But again, we're into the billions of human beings, billions of individuals. Back then, a few thousand, probably not even 100,000. You know, they were in the number of 1,000. So very few individual humans to compete for the richness of life, of edible life along the coast. So even if, what I'm trying to say about this is, even if the land is desert, I could still survive along the coastline, which is also an incentive to continue moving along the coastline. That's what it's showing here, you know.
Actually, there was more land. See, they're receding.
And there was, yes.
Today. So more land bridges to move on.
Exactly. I was getting there because according to this theory, as those Homo species continue to move eastward, right, into Asia, here is the Indian subcontinent, and stay along the coastline for a couple of reasons at least, not only for reasons of food availability along the coast, but also the climate or the weather, okay? Because the further in you go in the continents, the colder it's gonna get.
Well, also at Lake Victoria, I was just double checking.
Yeah.
Because they had the headwaters of the Nile, so
Yes.
theoretically,
Yes.
individuals or the tribes, as it were, could use the Nile
Yes.
to also go up, not just the land bridge, but along the coast of the Nile.
Yes, which would also be fertile and so forth. It's just that this map, we can say it's a selective map in that it's only showing the coastal migration. It's not showing a radial migration that could have and actually occurred throughout all of Africa. All right, all of Africa, including up the Nile, if you will, geographically going north, but it's flowward, it's down the Nile. So it depends up the Nile or down the Nile, along the Nile River, all the way to the Delta, which would be around here somewhere where Egypt is. Right?
How
The dispersal?
out of Africa, the dispersal to the Nile would imply that was more of a gradual dispersal, that they went both along the river and to the coast.
And along the coast, yes, fine, yes. Good point. So they could have also moved along this way and crossed the peninsula, gone into the Arabian Peninsula. But keep in mind, going into the Arabian Peninsula, what you're going to find there is the certification. Okay, it could be, this is totally speculative, but that could be dovetailing with the flight from Egypt narrative in biblical terms, that it's estimated, well, if Egypt was the real Egypt of today, my goodness, you can actually see the delta of the Nile here. That little green triangle, you see here? I just noticed that. This map is so accurate, being a photograph, that you can see a little green dot, little green triangle here. That's the delta of the Nile River, and you can actually trace the Nile here on the greenery, right? It's growing along the coast of the Nile, where there's the rest, east and west, it's all desert, including the Arabian Peninsula. I had noticed that before. Okay, so anyway, the map here is only focusing on the coastal dispersal, okay, as the most likely dispersal pattern. But I wanted to point out what Lisa just mentioned is that as we go further east, especially into Southeast Asia, which is here, okay, the original pattern, maybe 100,000 years ago, as recently as 100,000 years ago, the land masses were fuller and there were more land bridges. Granted, it was shallow, you know, maybe just a few feet above sea level, but above sea level enough to walk through it, okay? Whereas the brown, in this case now, is brown. The brown outline is the current seacoast, right? It's the current seacoast, including Australia. And look at New Guinea here. They were actually bridged, connected, back as maybe as recent 100,000 years ago, because this is focusing about 65,000 years ago. So we can see the gradual colonization following the shoreline, but obviously from here there would be migrations in also, okay? Some clans would venture in, some families would venture into, and in fact they did, because there are fossils all over Asia, all over Europe that have been found to this date. Okay, just a couple more slides, a few more slides. All right, so those are the two prevailing models that I talked about. A single wave out or multi-regional, fine. The dispersal here is the same statement in a graphic way. It would be the origin of Homo, possibly Homo sapiens, and contact with Neanderthal in the Middle East, admixture, some interbreeding, moving into Europe and dispersing out into Asia, continental Asia. Then this is the Denisovian that I was pointing about, that I was talking about. Denisovian is another culture that has been found here in Southeast Asia and migrating into Guinea and Australia. On the northern part of the Asian eastern seaboard, the general Asian seaboard here, eastern seaboard, we have the migration through the Bering Straits, possibly during ice bridges, okay, in the winterization of the planet, and migrating down what is known as the Western Corridor or the Pacific Corridor, the Rocky Mountains and the Andes into South America, the Great Plains, and even north into Greenland. This would be Greenland, through what is today Canada and the northern territories of Canada. Okay, so these are migration patterns. They're speculative, but there's some evidence, fossil evidence and cultural, material cultural evidence that they found along the way to establish this pattern. it's a little beyond getting a little too much into the weeds as it were for the purpose of the course itself, just to prove that there's sufficient evidence to suggest the evolution of Homo sapiens as the only existing species of the Homo, the genus Homo. And what I'm going to leave you for homework, if you look at starting to dovetail into the theological end of things, which we'll do next lecture, please look at these two concepts. Mitochondrial Eve and its male counterpart, sort of, is Y chromosomal Adam, okay? Y chromosomal Adam, which are, it's pointing to, the adjectives here are distinct structures that are either only in women or only in men, supposedly, which is the DNA in the mitochondria is essentially inherited through the maternal line for the women, because that those mitochondria are going to come from the egg, from the ovum, which has more cytoplasm than the sperm. And of course, in that cytoplasm is going to be the mitochondria. So the future zygote, if you will inherit the mitochondria, and mitochondria have their own DNA. So we can do mitochondrial, the experts can do mitochondrial DNA analysis and sequencing, and we can trace our maternal line up the tree, all right, through the women in our generations, in our previous generation. The mothers of the mothers of the mothers of the mothers. All right, that's mitochondrial Eve. Y, by analogy, Y chromosome Adam. Well, because this only works for men, all right? For men, we inherit our Y chromosome, which is what genetically makes us male, from our father. So we can do a similar going up the tree, if you will, up the branches, paternally through our fathers and the Y chromosome, all right, and the Y chromosome sequencing. Anyway, I kind of given you away the homework, but look it up, read up into it, because what's interesting is that the wording that is being used by scientists on this kind of phylogenetics. All right, but we have to tweak it. They're not, they didn't necessarily coincide in time. Adam and Eve, these mitochondria on this Y chromosome, Adam and Eve, did not necessarily coincide, or they did not arise at the same time necessarily, all right, which then makes a difference with the biblical account and so forth. Anyway, I'm telling you too much. Read up on it. We'll talk about it more next time. That's basically what I have. So let's recap here for a moment. With regards to the possibility of human evolution, at least from the physical evidence, all right, from the empirical side of things that can be measured. First, the phylogeny that we can do with percentage homology of other species that are living today, and tracing back percentage homology with a phylogenetic tree so that we can come up with this kind of diagram pointing to common ancestors at the different nodes. Also, then the fossil record that we find on the Homo line and the Australopithecines in the primate grouping. With the fossil record, specifically interesting is to look at the skull size as an external expression or physical expression of the brain volume, and the assumption that a larger brain has more capacity for thinking, all right, and more ability for survival. Then the association of that skull size or brain size with cultural development, still material culture, all right, and eventually the jump into symbolic or meaningful communication with art, for example, or religion. Bipedalism, back to offering a mechanical mechanism, an actual physical mechanical mechanism for the increase in brain size, freeing up of the hands, which also may lead to development of tools, harnessing fire, and developing actually a material culture, which is way more sophisticated than any kind of culture that we may see in other animals, all right? Okay, folks, you've been very attentive and patient. That's all I have for today. So, questions, comments, anything?
Father, last night, Thursday night, across the country, there was a showing of 6 episodes of The Twilight Zone.
Oh my goodness,
big
wow.
screen.
It took me back to the youth.
The Calamans, who are one of the episodes.
Yes?
And they come, and I mean, when you watch the series, it's absolutely fascinating that in 1959 to the early 60s, what Serling could do. But the thing that was most interesting about the Calamans is they were 9 feet tall, but their brain size, and again, this is before it was probably doubled what the human brain was, but how they were depicting them, and that this was such an advanced science before I think people actually understood the brain size.
In the 50s.
Like you were saying, so the fact that sapiens actually decreased and maybe became more effective, and so therefore was able to become smaller. At least that concept that Serling used in the episode was absolutely fascinating.
It is, isn't it?
Looking at the brain size of these people, and then again, when we talked about being the largest, that they were bigger animals, that they were 9 feet tall, and
physically larger,
and then,
Little pointing out toward like what we would consider the Neanderthals today, right? Larger head, larger body, and yet they didn't have necessarily the survival advantage because of that.
Yeah, but it was pretty interesting what Serling could come up with 40, 50 years ago.
Truly, I mean, I have a lot of admiration for science fiction that is plausible, all right? Science fiction that is so well done that it could happen.
In some cases did.
And yes, exactly. Well, I mean, just to go back to the 50s and the 60s, to my time as a youth, remember the Dick Tracy watch? Remember Dick Tracy? How many of you remember Dick Tracy? I remember Dick Tracy. Some of you, you may not want to admit it, but I remember the comics that Dick Tracy was, was fascinating. And he had this watch that he could talk through the watch and see images and so forth. Oh, that's the iWatch of today, right? Star Trek.
The walkie-talkies in Star Trek, and the transponders.
Yes. Right?
Yeah.
The Star Trek actually looks primitive by today's standards with all the.
Yes.
I mean, the original one with all the devices that they have. I mean, even their tricorders were compared to what we do with our phone.
Yes. So there was a limit to their fantasizing, right? They couldn't fantasize enough to actually come up with the stuff that we're doing today, or that technology has. Yeah, the aqualung, I think, is another one where that was a big shift from the diving bell, where the diver was actually chained to the surface by a chain, right? The bell itself, the head. And so the ship was bobbing up and down on the surface, and they were used for detonating mines, the sea mines, and the poor diver would actually detonate with his body the mine. And then it was Jacques Cousteau who invented the aqualung, which would free the diver from the surface. And that was a quantum shift there. But science fiction would have it before. I remember, since we're fantasizing about last century, how about, what was it, Gordon? What was the name? Flash Gordon. Yeah, Flash Gordon. A little rocket. You can see the smoke coming out of Flash Gordon. And his Buck Rogers and his suit, right? Well, say NASA was copying Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. Okay. From the sublime to the ridiculous. And speak of NASA, I'll leave you with the movie that I love, science fiction is The Martian, which at first, I tell you, the title was a put off for me because no, I don't want to see another green Martian walking around, you know, with sticky fingers. It has nothing to do with that. I don't know if you've seen the movie or not, but yes. Highly recommend it. You can probably download it for free now from Netflix or so. It's been a few years, but if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it as a very true science fiction, a very doable science fiction. It's actually about colonizing Mars, but there's a lot of human factor involved. The potatoes, huh?
Very, very
exactly. It does. It has a lot of.
One-man show in a lot of ways.
Yes. Yes.
It's wonderful.
Yes. But also, there's a lot of drama. There's a lot of humanity in it.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of humanity. The human factor, how it brings nations together and so forth. So, anyway, if you have a chance, take a look. The Martian. Okay, thank you very much. We've probably spoken more than we needed to today, or at least I did, but there it is. And we'll meet again next week. For now, we're going to pick up on the biblical or the theological, if you will, the religious account of creation, all right, their version of it, and how we can possibly integrate these two into a whole picture. I'm going to stop this now.